Nothing about your logical capacity is designed to help you seek truth. Truth is handy if it helps you survive. Lens 1 for the human brain, survival, food, water, safety, shelter. Lens 2, social. Social is survival for us. And a lot of the mysteries we see about human beliefs and behavior are much less mysterious if we use those lenses.
Welcome to Knowing and Believing, the podcast where we dive a little bit deeper into what we know and what we believe. And today is a pretty interesting podcast for me because I was able to sit down with Science Mike. And he's someone for me who's been very formative in helping me intellectualize my faith and belief structures, but also leave the door open for actually believing things that you cannot materially prove and why that's important. I was very lucky to get some time with him and check it out. The one critique I've had in my podcast is I need to shut up more. So I'm going to try and talk less.
I've had that critique as well on mine.
So I got 3 softball questions for you.
Okay.
And 9 hardball questions. And any of them you can push pass on or just say, you know, that's just not appropriate for us to talk about, right? Whatever. I don't know that I've ever heard you say something's not appropriate to talk about, though. So
no, I can't imagine what that would be.
Been fairly brave that way. Ooh, that's first time trying that. That's interesting.
Peach bear is quite good. It's one of my faves.
I'm a coconut guy.
Oh, I love the coconut too.
My wife hates what's good is the coconut with a little bit of fresh lime in it is actually really good.
Oh yeah.
So first softball question.
Okay.
Which you might not. This might be one you're not ready to talk about. So can you tell us what the new book's about, and if so, how's it coming?
Yes, the book. The title just got finalized, and it is "You're a Miracle and a Pain in Your Ass." That's the title.
I like it.
The subtitle is "Understanding the Hidden Forces That Make You You." So that'll come out in March of 2020.
Will you be reading it to me like you did your last book?
Yes, I'll definitely do the audiobook again, although
Great.
that is a pain. It's when I learned I can't say unfathomable, although I've gotten better at it. There's things I can write that I can't say. So, yeah, that book is kind of a look into Paul's dilemma. I don't understand myself. I do what I abhor, and I don't do what I think is right. You know that he writes it wrong.
Yeah.
So it's looking at that issue that kind of underpins all the great faith traditions, the mystery of like why we can want to do one thing and then do something else, and then exploring that through behavioral economics and cognitive psychology and interpersonal neurobiology, and a lot of this is probably the most raw, vulnerable, open I've been about my life and my experiences ever. It goes into a lot of stories and perspectives from the listeners and community that have assembled around Ask Science Mike and the Liturgist podcast. And it's primarily a book that is about solidarity and understanding. But there are things in there you can use to make changes in your life if you so desire. But my main goal is that someone would read this book and love and appreciate themselves more. That's what I want someone to get from You're a Miracle and a Pain in Your Ass.
I would imagine you're pulling from your own personal experience in that. And I've found personally that when dissecting my own process of thinking, believing, doing, acting, I'll talk less about me. I'm going to take the advice of other people.
I like hearing you talk.
Yeah. I know I pull from my own experience, emotions, like the idea of knowledge and emotions.
Yeah.
I can learn things and be comfortable with them pretty quick, but then my emotions catch up to me like 6 months later, and it becomes really difficult, and I have to step away from things for a while. How's that emotional journey been for you, which I imagine you're diving very deeply into to create this book?
Yeah, this book messed my life up in a big way. I guess I had all the information that I was putting in the book from day one. The problem is living my life in accordance with the things I've learned. I guess kickstarted a period of growth for me, but it's been really difficult growth.
New things or older things?
Older things, but like really putting them into practice. So
the older things.
Yeah, things I already knew. But I was challenged by a few friends, women and women of color, that I was so ready and open to learn from people in the pages of books and the writings of blog posts, but so reticent to engage in relationship with other people. And that's very true of me. And exploring why that is. My first book, Finding God in the Waves, came after a period of years of pretty significant life upheaval. And I was so excited to be in a place that I felt good again.
Right.
And I was reticent to kind of tip that apple cart of the post Finding God in the Waves place I was in. But you have to grow, you have to change, you have to face the things that are inside yourself. And for someone who makes their living like trying to inspire other people to more open and honest living by example, I'd felt like a hypocrite if I didn't kind of do the work. And it wasn't really, I didn't have a choice anyway. Orienting my life in a way that is open and vulnerable and supportive, ironically made my body and my feelings feel safe enough to start exhibiting symptoms of trauma and PTSD and things that I'd really kept buried before. And so the arc of this book is I started knowing everything I was going to talk about, but the process of writing it down and exploring it opened up some things I didn't know were there. And so in a very big way, the book is about me learning in my heart and in my body the information I started out with day one writing that book.
Huh. That's I find that it, to a large degree mirrors my own experience that I haven't fully been able to articulate. But yeah, the knowledge came and it's like, oh, okay, I step out of this with this knowledge, but then somewhere down the road, you just, like for me, I was, the first 10 years of my marriage were I was very, very self-centered and had a lot of learning to do. And we've come out of that and grown and have become better out of it. And I've become a lot better person from a lot of the critique of all of my friends and wife and family and everything else, which is a very, very difficult process. But I found I had to go to a place of cognitive behavioral therapy where I was thinking through, okay, right now this argument is activating my amygdala. I need to step back. And I found I went through a process of disassociating myself with my own emotions. And I found that I was starting to make fun of them most of the time or make fun of other people's emotions. Like I found emotions led me wrong in the past, caused me to be self-centered and everything else, and that I went to a degree where I was getting rid of emotion as a way of controlling my life and making myself a better person. And I think I'm on the journey right now of starting to maybe come back to allowing emotion and also trying to find a way of emotionally embracing what I believe in that way and allowing that to affect it to some degree. But I can't really fully articulate that yet at all, but working on it. So
Me too.
Yeah. Well, maybe your book will help me articulate and find that path a little bit once it comes out. Number 2, any advice for someone who is in reconstructing and strongly dislikes associating with groups like churches? I personally, I get really itchy when I get around a group. I don't know if you've ever heard George Carlin's take on how he loves individuals but hates groups. As they get into groups, they start to develop armbands, and then they start to go around at night, collecting people and stuff. And to me, I've always had that that itchiness with group think and group identity and everything else that it gives me some predisposition against religion and belief in that manner. How do you de and reconstruct from your experience while being standoffish towards group dynamics?
I don't look to any one group to be the end-all be-all fulfillment of human potential. So I'm still a church person.
Mm-hmm.
When what I look for in a church group, and by that I mean a group of people who compose a church, not a small group within a church, is table fellowship, the Eucharist,
mm-hmm.
and some form of communal spiritual expression, because I enjoy it, and some means of collectively applying some shared faith value in the world. So for me to like a church or want to go to a church, there needs to be the Eucharist. There needs to be, ideally for me at this point in my life, a liturgy. And there needs to be something that happens other than a liturgical service with that community that makes the faith matter in some way. It has to make a difference in the world for good.
Right.
And those things aren't that hard to find for me. But before I kind of returned to the church, I found great value in social grouping, like friends, real friendships.
Yeah.
That don't have a lot of expectation other than mutual support and honesty and intimacy.
Right.
And these last few years of my life, kind of 2013 on, I've had better, more intimate friendships than I've ever had in my life. They're fewer in number,
mm-hmm.
but I have an embarrassing wealth of people that I can be honest with, that I can be myself with, and where they can be themselves with me. And that's so key in our identity formation and our emotional actualization. And what I think happens a lot is people treat deconstruction and reconstruction like they're intellectual exercises. And I've just learned that there's an intellectual veneer on top of really deep issues in the emotional brain and in the body. And that social belonging actually helps us process those things in pretty dramatic ways. I don't think someone can go through deconstruction and reconstruction without going through a pretty intensive therapy process and dealing with grief and dealing with the manner of thinking in which we deconstruct has a name in psychology, and it's intellectualization. You take something that was once very vital and meaningful and emotional for you, which was a belief about God, and then you pick it apart with your analytical brain, and in doing so protect yourself from feelings of grief and feelings of loss and feelings of betrayal. And so I think a lot of times when people say, I can't really plug back into community, often what I hear, based on my experience and what I've researched, is my brain, especially my intellectual brain, is working very hard to protect me from some feelings that feel dangerous. In fact, they might feel so dangerous that I don't ever feel them, right? When people say I never feel angry, and I'm a person who says that, what that generally means is I actually have some very serious trauma and therefore some strong defensive strategies with anger. For someone else, that might be grief. For someone else, that might be loneliness. There's all these things, and they are present in deconstruction, reconstruction conversations.
Mm.
But in white Protestant communities, those feelings are always pushed to the side because in our enlightenment way, we're like, behold the mighty intellect.
Mm.
And if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, the intellectual brain is a hitchhiker that just got in the car 5 minutes ago and is trying to drive. What I've spent the last 2 years learning is our emotions have profound and ancient wisdom, and our life is better when we learn to accept them and relate to them and let the intellectual brain play well with them. It's not that I'm saying we should always follow our feelings. That's not it.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is that our feelings have tremendous wisdom, and when they're silenced is when we have all these unpredictable behaviors in our life, and when we have these unexpected or we're social animals. So when we have trouble connecting with others socially, there is something underneath that, and it's almost always an emotional thing.
Interesting. Yeah. In my own intellectualization of my deconstruction process, I've gone to such a degree that even the idea of the idea of sex becomes a weird thing.
Yeah.
Like the female gets moist and the male and I start to see a nature show of two bugs that is just like, why do we write songs about this? And why do we, this is just, but then in the moment, it's like all of that's gone and you're just experiencing that connection, with your wife or whoever. And it's beautiful. But the intellectualization can take that away. And that's just one thing I noticed myself that like I was sitting in the bathtub watching, you might've seen it, LeBron James did the barbershop thing. I think it was on HBO. And I remember sitting there, it was just after I was sick and I was exhausted and I'm watching it, and they started talking about the struggles within their community and what they experienced growing up. And all this, I felt this deep sense of empathy all of a sudden. And I was like, whoa, emotion, and just the week before or earlier that week, my wife had said, I think you're detaching yourself from your emotions, or you're doing something here that's not healthy. And like right after that, I came back downstairs and I was like, I think I've detached myself from my emotion. So it's interesting. Within your answer to question 2, you answered question 3. Aside from what criteria do you choose to find that community for church for you? What kind of criteria do you set a criteria, or do
Sure,
you
I want a
out?
woman pastor.
Why is that?
We've had plenty of male pastors. I'm not saying men can't be pastors. I'm saying that for now they've had their day, and an intentional course correction is important to me. I think it makes it easier to confront some of the patriarchal assumptions of faith communities when a woman is the spiritual leader of a faith community. I need any church I'm a part of to be affirming of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And by that, I mean they can be members. They can be baptized. They can be married. They can serve as clergy. They can do anything in the church anyone else can do. And I need to hear from church leaders. I need them to speak out on pressing issues of justice in our day. That does not mean I need to agree with them politically. What it means is we must agree that action is necessary and that people of faith have a role to play. And there needs to be the Eucharist. So
I've wondered if historically church leadership has been male, but I wonder with the evolution of societies and religion, if the point we've come to in first world societies, if the ideas of spirituality become more relational, and if speaking in generalities again, women are generally more skilled in relational roles as a general thing. To me, it seems like there's more of a need for that type of ministering when it comes to relating to spiritual issues at this point in time. I don't know.
I'd agree. Yeah. I think it's important for men to see how women relate in community and to start to emulate that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I like one of the many reasons I prefer my pastors to be women.
The pastor actually where my wife still goes is a woman, and she's doing a great job. Mother of my close friend. And it's funny, as soon as she took over the church is when I left, and I always felt bad about that, but wasn't anything to do with her. But
yeah.
Now on to the hardball questions.
Okay.
So a formative thing for me has been a good friend of mine who I always looked up to, essentially lost his faith and ran his life into the ground in some ways. And it was someone that I really looked up to, and I still very much look up to that person. But it was a moment of, you can't put people on a pedestal. Everyone's human. And losing that was a moment of like, all right, I need to stand on my own to a degree. And your book of having the experience on the beach and seeing, the reality stretch thin and seeing the vastness of the universe. I'm not recalling it exactly, but to me, that was at the point in time when you read the book to me, it was some glimmer of hope, like maybe there is still a God or something out there at that point in my deconstruction. And in a more recent podcast, and I kind of held on to that for a while, and in a more recent podcast you had done, you had mentioned that you can see apparitions at night when you go to the bathroom, and it's can you please get out of my way, else I'm going to walk through you, and and that for me was a point of these don't add up, and how in my mind, in your mind, how do those make sense, or what do those say to you between those
What
two?
do what say?
Well, the ability to feel that God was speaking to you in some way, or an idea of God was speaking to you on the beach, but then to have an apparition in the hallway when you're going to the bathroom that doesn't mean anything.
I see.
And you can take a pass on that. We can
No,
edit
it's
it
fine. All human experiences are hallucinations.
Yeah.
Everything you see is something your brain is manufacturing using mostly sensory data, but not entirely. When you look at, if you could imagine seeing the raw feed that comes out of your eyes, it's so dramatically different from your field of view.
Can they visualize that?
Or you could, knowing the features of an eye. And on significant enough doses on substances,
Gotcha.
you can turn all that software off as well. So, babies are in a perpetual psychedelic.
Right.
I
mean, they're just sitting there looking at
because their brains haven't learned to filter and create coherence out of the chaotic information our senses create. So, of course, we can see wondrous things. I'm a person who has suffered from pretty tremendous and repeat traumatic experiences. And that means I'm a person who has dissociative tendencies.
Can you explain dissociative to me and a
dissociative tendency is a aptitude to have dissociative experiences, and dissociation is a way of going into a safe place in your mind in times of danger.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I'm never frightened in horror movies, or really at all it's very difficult, if not impossible, to startle me, because instead of starting like everyone else, I dissociate and then come back slowly. What we found in research is people who have dissociative tendencies are much more likely to have mystical experiences. So we see the great prophets and teachers from religion have often undergone tremendous suffering. Their brains as a defensive capacity, they have this ability to separate from reality, to make a different interpretation of what's in the mind and what's beyond it. So I have no doubt that the fact that I'm a person with CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is very related to the fact that I saw a light on a beach. Now, does that mean my experience with God was completely fabricated by my brain? That's entirely plausible. But could it mean also that there's a reason that faith traditions often describe God as being especially with those who have suffered? I don't know. I don't care to reconcile that or work through it. I know that when I approach that light on the beach, it provides tremendous meaning in my life and a strength to keep going each day and an inspiration to love others deeply and serve them well. The idea that my house is haunted doesn't do those things. So I just say, oh, look, my brain's doing a funny thing.
Wow.
And I don't trouble myself with it at all. We have to choose what experiences we invest in and which ones we do not. That doesn't mean I'm like in some way closed off to the idea of spiritual things, but I find them, probably about as, or spirits, not spiritual things, like literal
right
apparitions of humans who have lived. I find that even less likely than the notion of God as a being.
So I think you had done a podcast with Ryan Bell. I think it was the first place that I had that I came across your work. He used to be an Adventist pastor, and that's my background is Adventism as well. And you had described yourself as a materialist mystic. And do you still find yourself processing the world in that way?
Absolutely, yes. More than anything else, spiritually I am a mystic, and epistemologically I am a materialist.
And how would you define mystic?
A mystic is a person who says the essence of what is spiritual and divine cannot be accurately described with language. It can only be known and experienced.
I like that.
I did not come up with it.
You could trademark it. All right. So with your recent explorations into altered states of consciousness through both meditation and chemical means, what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts on consciousness and where thoughts come from?
Oh, my. The idea I'd be willing to defend would be that consciousness is... what I'd be willing to defend is the notion that consciousness is a feedback loop wherein something that's modeling reality becomes aware of itself.
Okay, say that again, slower.
It's easier. It's Michio Kaku's idea, a physicist's notion of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So in that way, the most primitive form of consciousness would be a thermostat.
Right.
Thermostat knows the temperature of the room. It can turn the air on. When it cools down, it can turn it off. It can respond to the changes in the environment it's made. So as you add more loops, you get more sophisticated consciousness, all the way up to sentience, where sentience is a consciousness that's aware of itself.
Right.
Where do thoughts come from? The physical phenomena that enable that modeling and loops. So in our case, primarily neurons.
I had an experience while attempting to meditate, and from what I've heard you talk about, you're pretty experienced with it and maybe more easily equipped to do it with, was it dissociative tendencies? Like both myself, my dad, and my son all seem to have very highly active thoughts, just constantly, just going. But one morning I was trying to just quiet my mind. I get up usually around 5, and it's the only time I can be alone and think. And the window was cracked, and there was a cricket outside. Normally, every other morning, I'm very sensitive to noise, and like the mechanical noise of the refrigerator or whatever else. Just I can't There's a little crickets out there, and he's just. And normally, I feel like I don't know what I would call my observer, is plastered against kind of the Times Square. You know how they just have these images just flying around the outside of buildings. Well, imagine a ring around you, but your conscious observer is plastered out against that. And that's how I feel most of the time, is that I'm just plastered on this thing and there's thoughts flying everywhere. I'm trying to stop the thoughts, but dealing with what they call monkey brain, I guess. But this cricket all of a sudden is going, and it's like watching fire. It kind of starts to put your brain into alpha waves, I think. But this little cricket's going, and then all of a sudden, I just peel off of that kind of jumbotron kind of thing and right into the middle. And I'm not separated from the thoughts. I still see them out there going around, but I'm not caught in them. And it was just this moment where I was fully conscious, fully aware, and it was just all of a sudden a disconnected piece where I came into the center of that, and all that noise was out there. And it's the first time, as someone who was raised in a very conservative Christian tradition, I thought about my observer consciousness and my thoughts are two separate things. And that was such a weird moment and thought for me. Have you had any similar experience with, I mean, you were raised in a similar conservative Christian Baptist background. Did you ever have moments like that where you started to come across
That's my whole life, though. I mean, ever since I was a very young child, I would turn my thoughts on themselves and try to figure out how everything was working in my mind.
Wow.
So I had experiences like that when I was very young, probably 9. Yeah.
Well, experiences like that where you felt like you could be separated.
I would call
from
what
that
you're
stream.
describing as presence.
Yeah.
Simply being truly present in the moment.
Interesting. Do you think being on the autism spectrum has given you the incredible value that you are in some way, the incredible value that you are to observe and process the human experience and animal that we all are, but it seems like you have this autistic on some spectrum soup that you live in that is your experience, but also this incredible intelligence that you're able to be somewhat disconnected or whatever, but process that and translate it into something that the rest of us understand in some way. Because I've often thought, like, how's this guy making sense of all this, where I feel like I'm just kind of tumbling down a river in the rapids of knowledge and feelings at the same time and everything else, and I can't even separate, thoughts from consciousness. And have you ever?
Thoughts are a part of consciousness for sure.
But where do they come from, and why can't I shut them off?
Well, I think let's step away from the theoretical for a moment.
Okay.
And let's sit in the practical.
Right.
You can't shut your thoughts off, and trying to is an exercise in futility. If we think structurally, your thoughts are you becoming aware of different systems in your brain communicating. Okay. And the part of your brain that is aware the observer, as
Right.
you, and I also often call it, the little patch of tissue behind your forehead. Well, thoughts are happening all over the brain. Feelings are happening all over the brain. And you just got this little tissue watching.
Is that the pineal?
That would be the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
Yeah. So your observer
Right.
lives up there. Your another key component of your consciousness is your ability to experience sensation. And that happens in a very different part of your neocortex, the outermost layer of the brain. That happens primarily in the parietal lobe of your brain. So when we're present, we're creating communication and relation between the observing part of the brain and the experiencing part. Thoughts can still happen, but the point is, in most minds, thoughts are a survival mechanism, and there's no penalty for having thoughts running constantly, especially if they help you survive.
Right.
The difficulty is our rampant thoughts tend to fill us with anxiety and distraction. And so that when we're having a moment in our lives that we enjoy and anticipate, we're unable to do so because all these thoughts are flying around trying to keep us alive. So don't try to turn your thoughts off. Simply try to be aware that you are having them. So that moment when you went from the wide view of Times Square to centered in the middle of it and watching it, you were doing that. You become aware, wow, these are my thoughts. Just listen to them. Isn't that marvelous? And actually, if I just listen, I'll find all kinds of things. I'll find the weight of my body in the chair. I'll find the warmth of the chair against the back of my legs. I can feel the pressure of my feet on the ground. Gosh, I can feel an ache in my ankle from where I twisted it years ago, but it's kind of a chilly day. And we, in our presence, unite our observer and our sensory awareness and in a way that is freeing. So the more often you do that, you'll find you can influence with intention where your observer focuses. And so instead of focusing on your thoughts, you focus on your breath or the sound of a refrigerator that would usually drive you crazy. And you focus on the fridge sound and the fact that it makes you crazy and go, what? It is. You don't even go, why? You simply say it is. And often this focus creates relief. You might find that as you listen with intention, your anxiety drops. One thing that happens to me when I meditate, I get an itch. I never scratch the itch. I rest my attention on it until it fades away in these really marvelous and interesting ways. I have an itch on the back of my head right now that I'm simply putting my attention on, and I can kind of feel the sharpness of the itch fuzz out, and it becomes a different sensation and then fades over time. When you are doing this, when you're resting your attention on something, the monkey brain, the train of thoughts, as I sometimes think of it, will barge through the space, and you go, wow, I had a thought. Hi, thought. And you just let it on its way, and you return your attention to wherever it was you wanted your attention to rest. A breath, your own breath is a particularly easy thing because it's always there, and there's a lot of sensation associated with it.
Right.
And over time, the practice of acknowledging and dismissing your thoughts actually means you have fewer and fewer of them until you can sit sometimes for 30 minutes or 60 minutes and never be disturbed by a thought. You can simply be present in the moment. But you are training your brain in the same way you train a dog or a horse. You cannot teach your dog anything with a lecture. Your dog only learns through experience. And that's also true for the vast majority of your own brain.
Why do you think it is that the more conservative Christian religions so strongly, well, in my experience, so strongly avoid things like meditation? I mean, does the Baptist tradition kind of
absolutely.
think of it as
absolutely.
a work of Satan?
I don't even know.
Yeah.
I don't even know.
I had an experience of being at a therapist's office, and she was like, "Why don't we listen to this Scottish man? And walking, it'll be a calming exercise." And even that was on the border of too much for some of the people I was with at the time, and we couldn't go back to that therapist anymore because
I'm sure.
But yeah. So
social taboos are powerful motivators.
I'm finding as I'm starting to reconsider emotions and important social boundaries, that there's definitely truth in some of them, and it's a process of discerning which ones do and don't have value. And okay, so this question borders on science, which you're the man of, and philosophy, and it goes into the free will determinism thing, and I still don't understand compatibilism. It doesn't make sense to me. But I've been working with this idea. This is where I found the conversation of belief and atheism to really intersect, was a lot at this idea of free will, and do we have it, or are we just a collection of deterministic reactions? And in my head, I came up for some reason with this thought experiment. And if we were someday, I just turned off in my head. Am I back on?
Yeah, you should be good.
All right. If we were able to someday actually be able to do a Dyson sphere, harness power of the sun with the thing, and then empower a supercomputer with it, quantum or normal. I don't know that enough about computers. I've heard you discuss the limits of quantum computing, and it all went right over my head. But if we are able to make
I can't even conceive of a computer that would require the power of the sun. But I'll follow along.
Let's go sci-fi and pretend they've made it, and they can map every bit of matter and anything in the universe with it. And you can then enter into this computer. This is assuming we're deterministic. We can enter into the computer, well, what if we do this? And then it can, since everything is deterministic, it can spit back out, this is what will happen. And so at that point, if we're deterministic, what we've created is a future scene feedback loop that we can enter possibilities into and then get feedback from to determine if that would be a good or bad thing to do, if we are truly deterministic, to make that possible. The interesting thing to me at that point, if all of this is not just ridiculous mumbo jumbo that I'm coming up with in my head and way off, the interesting thing is at that point we've essentially made what we would consider to be kind of a god telling us what to do and what not to do. And with human nature, we would probably take that information and then go and try and control other people with it, to tell them, the great feedback loop has told us we need to do this, behave in that way, and this, the other, to have the best eventual outcome if we're deterministic. Then, to me, that thought experiment, the feedback on that I get is that, well, I already have a supercomputer, really, in my own head, running a feedback loop just with kind of the power of a flashlight, seeing into the computer that if I decide to jump out of this chair and look like I'm about to attack you from this side, you're probably going to go over there, and it's going to be an odd situation, and let's not do that. We have a feedback loop predicting the future constantly in our head with choices that we're making. And it's just an odd conflict in there to push back on determinism actually being a thing. Have I made any sense at all?
You have made sense. I think there's a couple of assumptions in that train that lessen the power of the critique.
Okay. This is pretty much the only place I could get this kind of feedback.
Just because reality is deterministic does not mean we would ever be able to model reality computationally.
But even if everything is deterministic?
The problem is the data set of everything is not simply enormous in our current cosmological understanding. It is, in fact, infinite. So a supercomputer powered by our sun is so woefully underpowered in storage capacity and computational capacity to even run a simulation of itself.
Right.
Because of quantum dynamics and the sheer number of quantum phenomena there are in my pinky nail. We are unaware. Number one, we have an insufficient understanding of reality on its most fundamental levels to accurately model anything. Two, even if we had a better understanding, there may be no more efficient way to compute physical phenomena than the physical phenomena itself. So you can't even model a full physical set, a fixed set of, say, the components of a computer on a computer itself, because you can't get free information. We don't know of any math that basically lets you compress the amount of data of a system into the system itself. So yes, your brain has this really specialized hardware called an orbitofrontal cortex that does constantly make predictions about the future, but it's doing that with a very summarized model, and that all the reason that hardware is still there is because it's right enough to keep us alive. But your orbital frontex is wrong constantly, and almost any time you use your intuition to try to tell you about physics or economics,
right,
or how many calories you've eaten in a day, you are dead wrong. So simulations have limits, even in a deterministic universe. So sort of what's interesting to me about the free will versus determinism debate is like the implications on our daily living is infinitesimal, because even a deterministic quantum reality to a human being is indecipherable from free will.
I guess it just gets at the deeper question of, if everything is deterministic, it seems like to me the result is that there is nothing other than matter, and that eliminates any possibility of a ghost or soul in the machine.
There are definitely things other than matter. We know that. Photons have no mass.
Right.
All the virtual force carrying particles aren't matter. That doesn't mean they don't exist.
I'm already underwater here.
To say things are material is not to say everything is physical and tangible. Okay. It does mean everything is measurable, at least by indirect means.
So the technical assumptions on my thought experiment are not possible.
So what so often happens, because human brains have a limited capacity. The reason we suck as a species at answering these questions, people don't know enough about all the necessary disciplines. Philosophers are almost comically ill-equipped with their understanding of physics, and physicists are comically ill-equipped with their understandings of philosophy. Comically. So when we start to dig in these questions, we build these thought experiments or these mathematical models, which even the things that humanity knows today, you can tear them apart, which is why I'm such a nihilist, right? Like, there's only so much a person can know. And which is also why I'm a pragmatist. Like, on free will versus determinism, I'm like, okay, if we have free will, what implications on daily life? And the chance that we live in a deterministic universe, the main thing it tells me is I should be compassionate with people.
Right.
And that my notions of criminal justice should be less pinned to moral responsibility and more societal benefit and rehabilitation, right? Like, and
Yeah.
the problem is whether or not the universe is deterministic. Me saying I care less about moral failings and more about good for society just happens to have like better outcomes for people. And that's what I always strive for in my way of living and what I know. I'm very outcome focused.
Right.
I don't mind if I have a bad set of assumptions that create good outcomes. Like, what if climate change isn't caused by people and we just make changes that make the air cleaner and the water cleaner?
Still a good
Fantastic.
idea.
Yeah, it was. So what? The assumption was wrong.
Right.
Yeah, let's make it good outcomes for people as much as we can.
How does materialism play into your take on truth? I have an analogy that I think I won't be able to have taken apart. If I
would say I am far better at taking things apart than putting them together.
I am by nature a critic myself. If I stand an inch from a jumbotron,
Yes.
I'm going to see the red, green, and blue dots.
Yes.
And that will be the material truth of that. But if I stand back 300 feet, I'll see that two people are getting engaged. And I'll see the meaning of it.
Sure.
So is the mystic 300 feet back looking at all the data points and making sense of them, but the materialist is standing an inch from the jumbotron?
Yes. But the mystic also acknowledges that the same 300-foot view can inspire different perspectives which are equally valid. So if the jumbotron is projecting an image where some people see two faces and other people see a vase, I'm not going to fight about is it a face or a vase. I'm going to say at the fundamental level, it's pixels. And we know what the pixels are doing.
All right. In your opinion, is there any danger to embracing logic and reason too deeply? The ancient Egyptians supposedly felt that logic and reason could strip you of meaning if embraced too wholeheartedly. I've personally found that to be true.
I just remember what logic and reason are here for. Survival mechanisms, not truth-seeking mechanisms.
Aren't they to some degree, though?
Nothing about your logical capacity is designed to help you seek truth. Truth is handy if it helps you survive. But your brain doesn't give two shits about what is true. Your brain cares very much about what will help you survive, which means, is that water? Is it poisonous? Those are truths you want to nail. Right? Those are things that your brain is very good at. Very, very, very good at. And a 5-year-old is really good at telling what is water and does it stink. Right?
Right.
But a survival thing for a social primate is social acceptance. So most of our beliefs stem from social acceptance. They have nothing. I think the whole thing about truth and logic and reason is just people deceiving themselves about what their brains do. It appears our rational capacity comes to rationalize our feelings to convince other people to go along with our point of view. Or when we lose, to rationalize why we assent to the other viewpoint. Lens 1 for the human brain, survival, food, water, safety, shelter. Lens 2, social. Social is survival for us. And a lot of the mysteries we see about human beliefs and behavior are much less mysterious if we use those lenses. It is true for scientists as well.
Oh yeah, to me it's interesting the degree of protective culture that now surrounds evolution in the same way that protective culture surrounds religion.
Yeah.
Because they're just attack. And there was an unbelievable episode where they kind of delved into that a little bit it was maybe a symposium on evolution or something, but they started talking about like, all right, we don't talk about this up front, but we're going to talk about this behind closed doors as here's a problem with our current model of evolution that we need to work on.
Yes.
It was behind doors.
Yes.
Not up front.
Which is an attempt to be pragmatic, because one of the problems with science is when people admit a weakness with the model, the public goes, ha ha, it's wrong. It's like, whoa. You see what I mean? So I can sympathize with that. But absolutely. And that concerns me less than some more fundamental problems in the sciences, in my opinion, is the bias against publishing negative results, the ways we don't fund someone doing a reproduction of an existing result.
Right.
We have systemic biases and incentives towards publishing positive results, which means setting a set of criteria you think is going to work before you run the experiment. And that creates huge blind spots in the sciences. There is no means of human knowing that isn't riddled with errors. And that's really frustrating if you view the world as like truth and logic and reason, and really, really obvious is if you view human intelligence as a mechanism for survival. Because we are surviving. For the architectural goals of human intelligence, our intelligence is doing an exceptional job.
What do you think our psyche does when it realizes we're not having a problem surviving anymore?
For me, it's very liberating. Now, I want to be clear. Some people do have problems surviving.
Oh, absolutely. But I think
as a species overall, we're doing well.
Yeah.
An incredible number of individuals in our species are struggling in a way that is unjust, unfair, and unconscionable.
But I think there's something to an existence of a person who wants and needs for not much. And there's something about the psyche of that person at a point within a culture, subset of a culture like that then turns that search for meaning and truth becomes more important. Like, what is actually true? I think the mind can start to focus on what is real truth?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something to that. And I think that's where spiral dynamics plays into that to a degree. As you get more along that, there's a different search for that.
If you've heard me say spiral dynamics is Western-centric, the reason I say that is because I don't think that's the inevitable curve that happens when people's resource needs are met. I think that is a possible and often prescribed destination. I am finding that with intention and with having a social community that is more inclusive, when my resource needs are met, I wonder much less about what is true and much more about what I can do to make sure other people's basic needs are met. And oddly enough, in that search, I found much more meaning than I ever did seeking truth for truth's sake.
So that's really interesting to me. And I have a sneaking suspicion with myself, as soon as I actually start doing that, everything that I'm struggling with will fall away.
That was my experience. Everything I was struggling with fell away when I went all in on meaningfully addressing the suffering of others without ignoring the fact that I am also a person who has physical and emotional needs.
Right. Truth seems to be infinitely truth seems to be infinitely reducible. I have an analogy in my head where if truth is on the horizon, by the time you get to that horizon, it's just moved beyond you. And it seems that truth is infinitely reducible. Do you believe anything is actually true, or is there only relative truths?
I believe there's possibly, verging on probably, real truth. I don't think a human brain can build a high fidelity enough model to know real truth. I think because we can only work with, depending on the person, 3 to, and what time of day and how old they are, 3 to maybe 8 working chunks of memory at a time. We can't even know ourselves.
Yeah.
So we're certainly not going to understand fundamental aspects of reality. Now, maybe in a collective search working together, we can piece together a more and more accurate view over time and zoom in on little moments and catch glimpses. But I don't think anyone has ever fundamentally understood so much as an electron.
Another kind of weird one. If I imagine shrinking myself down to the size of the smallest form of anything we could imagine and would be able to stand amongst a collection of these smallest things, whatever the matter of our, or the substance of our existence is made of. As a thought experiment, if I can imagine that, I stand amongst them and I think, what causes these things to organize themselves into larger organizations that have the desire to live, love, and, not cease being conscious? How do you picture that? Or do you ever consider that? And where does desire, because I've often run this across the idea of people being afraid of artificial intelligence, like it would have a nefarious side to it. Well, it would only have what we programmed into it. What's been programmed into us using these most basic bits of whatever we're made of that make us have desires, love, and all that?
Well, first of all, if you shrunk down to quantum level, you would turn into a singularity and consume a lot of matter, and then through Hawking radiation evaporate.
But just as a thought experiment, not for real.
If you fix that problem, the second problem would be is that you would not be able to see or observe anything because the receptors in your body systems would now be far too small. You couldn't. Your eyes would receive no photons.
But more as a philosophical question.
If you're saying, why do those things do what they do?
Yeah, I mean, do we have any inkling why matter arranges itself into what ultimately is the highest form of consciousness?
Gravitation, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces,
and we still
the Higgs
have
field.
No clue where those come from.
I guess, why do they have to come from anywhere?
I guess I just want to know.
Yeah, I sometimes think we project our need to know onto the universe. And our need to know emerges from our biology.
To secure our position. And
the better we understand the world, our species has done quite well understanding enough about the world to throw things. I mean, what really separated us from the other animals was being able to throw things, rocks and sharpened sticks.
Right.
Suddenly we're like the apex of apex predators, even though
When's the last time you watched 2001 Space Odyssey?
It's been a while.
I just watched that last week for the first time. And
oh my gosh.
Moment of, look what I can do with this. And it was like, ooh, as coming from my background to watch that, it was a little bit of a, yeah.
So I think more our need to know why comes from that.
An idea of we need to know so
that
we can.
Quantum phenomenon needs a why.
See, I think we form our religions in the same manner. We need to know why, we need to know what.
Absolutely.
So we can package it up, put it on the shelf, so I can use that later.
There's a part of your brain that looks for faces. Mine's broken, but most people have it. And if you see like a knot of wood that looks like it has eyes and a nose and a mouth, you go, oh, a face.
Right.
That is a biological function that searches for intelligence in the world. Because you need a different reaction to an animal you've never seen than a rock to survive. So
right.
that searching for agency in the world is a survival feature.
Interesting.
That we then project onto the physical universe, which I suspect, but do not know, simply is what it is.
Well, again, do you think that part of your brain that's not doing that has gifted you something to be able to see more of the, to see behind the curtain more?
I don't know. I don't know that I see behind the curtain at all.
Oh,
I just
come on. What you do and what you see is so vastly special compared to the people normally going about their day.
I think everybody has a special and unique vantage point on reality.
Well, of course, but I mean,
I'm good at talking.
Don't disregard imposter syndrome. I mean,
No, I think you're right. I think my viewpoint is special and wonderful and unique. I just also think that about everyone's.
I think this right, but I think you specifically have a different skill set given your makeup that allows you to see things differently. That pushes you into that.
I'm great at talking about shit. Just great at talking about shit.
But you
world
perceive
class
things.
talking about shit.
But you perceive things. Like when I came in here today, I mean, you spent a good, and I'm in no way offended by it, but you spent like a good 60 seconds to like 2 minutes of not even acknowledging that someone had entered the room.
Yeah.
Because you were focused on a task.
It was my first time walking in this room being arranged this way.
And you were getting your
I'm
space.
autistic. That's a big deal.
Oh.
We've been preparing me for this moment for weeks that this studio would be rearranged.
Everything's in a new place and you're getting to know, and
that's the only way I could greet you or do this conversation.
Interesting. Huh. Well, let me just reiterate that.
Which, by the way, this is my new chair.
Yeah.
This is where I will sit from now on in this room.
Where were you before?
Well, this table was over there.
Yeah.
And my back was toward that wall.
Yeah.
I do better if my back's toward a wall.
Huh. Let's see.
That's weird. And I had some vague notion that you were here and I should talk to you, but I simply had to go through some things first before I could accommodate that information.
Okay, so my wife and I did a podcast a while ago around our difficulty if she's remained very conservative and very faith-oriented. And I've, departed from that to a large degree. And she listened to the one that you had just done with the honey badger. Mm-hmm. And, much of the stuff that she was describing, she says, I see about 25% of that in you, Trent. There's a large, if you're
autism is a spectrum.
Yeah, I would say
many people are
just
on it.
On the other side of the fence, probably, but
there's a part of that spectrum that we've cordoned off with diagnostic criteria, and that's called Autism Spectrum Disorder, which is distinct from being on the autism spectrum at all.
Right.
Autism Spectrum Disorder is a subset of the autism spectrum.
Okay. Yeah. I chronically would never introduce my wife anywhere we went because I always just kind of assumed you're so much more social. Why don't you do it?
I don't know who I know knows each other.
Oh.
So my problem is if I start introducing people, I will introduce people who already know each other and know each other well, who I've been around because my brain doesn't track that extra degree of social web.
Interesting.
I know who I know, and that's it.
Right. So now I've made a habit of just introducing everyone all the time.
Yeah.
I try and do that.
If I do that, then it will be embarrassing because I will. Plus, I'm face blind.
Yeah.
So if I see people
if we met again a week from now, do you recognize?
I didn't recognize you when you walked up.
Didn't.
I saw and I've seen your face many times.
I wouldn't say a lot, but I mean...
Enough. More than most people.
Yeah.
And I had to I was like, that's probably Trent.
Well, I haven't shaved in a long time, and I just did get new glasses, and I'm wearing a hat. So.
Right, which for someone who's face blind, you're a different person.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, because of the things I recognize people with, their hair, their facial hair, their glasses, you changed.
Yeah.
So I was like, huh, that could be Trent. And I'll solve that mystery after I get done setting up the room.
All right. Interesting. Okay, so to get back a little more sciencey, is there or science fictiony? Is there any way to test if I'm the single only consciousness in my reality, or that this might just be a simulation?
I don't believe so.
There's got to be a little hook in there that a genius could come up with.
I'm aware of none.
Yeah, that's the Elon Musk. Thinks he. Did you watch the podcast with Joe Rogan and Elon Musk?
Segments of it. I haven't seen the whole thing.
Is interesting. The way he described the amount of thoughts that he deals with felt familiar, but far worse than mine. Seems like he suffers with a highway of just endless.
Poor guy.
Last question. As you look back at your process of deconstruction, what do you wish you might have done differently, if anything?
Been kinder to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Been honest sooner.
Honest in what way?
Not hide that my beliefs were changing from other people. And I would have left my evangelical church a lot sooner.
Really?
For myself and for them.
Yeah.
That's not to say I regret anything that happened, but with hindsight, if I did it again, that's what I would do differently.
You find a lot of fulfillment and identity through socialization like that.
Of course. Yeah. Everyone does.
Nope. Like in a large group setting like that, for me, there's nothing worse for me than to go to a group meeting where everyone thinks the same and I can't question. That for me is just...
Oh, I'm a nonconformist. That drives me crazy too.
So, but how do you deal... Like, where is the fulfillment and joy that you find in church attendance?
The Eucharist.
What is the Eucharist? That's a term I'm not completely familiar with.
The table, the good gift, the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine. Do this in remembrance of me. That's the Eucharist.
All right.
Yeah.
So the everyone being there. Well, I guess you're part of a church now that's far more, yeah, Sally can believe this, Bob can believe that, but the idea is that we're coming together and searching together.
Yeah, right.
And in the Adventist tradition, it is so truth-centric that an interesting realization that I had was that I've generally found that if you asked an Adventist why they were Adventist, and this is a horrible thing to just put on everyone, but it was my experience, that if you asked an Adventist why they were Adventist, it would be because it has the truth.
Yes.
Not because it feeds my soul. That would be somewhere down the line because you knew you should say that, but it was because the search for truth. And that was just nailed down. And something within me that I'm still struggling with is bucking against that and trying to find where that middle line is between all of that. So, yeah.
That's your brain doing what it has done to keep you alive.
Yeah, I feel like I was just every week itching, trying. I saw everyone else feeling like everyone else was pretending that they were certain about these things and like really fully believed and had no questions, where my brain was like, no, wait, what? No, don't. I always had the analogy in my head of a truth gun, that if you put your head up to it and you weren't telling the truth, it would go off Would I put my head up to that and say, yes, I believe there's a God? No, I would have never done that, because I don't know if I'm telling the truth there. And for the longest time, I didn't really understand the difference between knowing and believing. And that's and that was the hardest thing for me, because in the culture that I came from, everyone knew. It wasn't like belief. It's the same thing as knowing, it seemed. Like, we're certain about these things. And you ask people and they'll say, we're certain about this. Well, then where's faith lie? The faith isn't, you don't need faith if you have certainty. Why? These don't mesh.
Yeah.
And so that whole thing, that whole community of how that works is very, very difficult for me to understand. And I haven't been able to remove myself from that completely, because all of my family is still within that. My children experience a lot of stress and anxiety for their father because he's not part of that anymore. It's very difficult for them, very difficult for my wife, but that all permeating just truth and all the backflips that they do to prove that truth is a very difficult thing to back away from and say, I'm embracing more so the principles of love that Christ embodied. That's like almost sacrilege in that community, which sounds so off and would be so offensive for an Adventist to hear, but is my experience. And I don't still quite know how to handle that and what to do with it, because my children are still deeply in it, and my wife still very much fully is embracing that. So appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me. Really appreciate everything you're doing. Thanks for your time. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Trent.